Mitchell. This is Fed Talks, and today I'm going to be talking about Trump as explained by basic economics. In short, this talk will present a few incredibly basic economic ideas and use them to critique what our president has planned for our country, and will determine whether it will make the American people better or worse off in the future. To begin with, a few misconceptions should be taken care of. First and foremost, we are in a trade deficit, but this is not necessarily a terrible thing. The short explanation is this. There are two accounts which serve to measure a country's imports, exports, and investments. The current account is a measure of the net amount of goods and services imported or exported in a country. In America, we have what is called a current account deficit. So that's represented by your red line here. So what this means is essentially we import far more goods and services than we export. However, contrary to what Trump suggests, this is not a horrible thing. When a country is as productive as we are in America, money that flows out into the world through the current account will ultimately flow back to us in the form of capital account surplus, which measures the investments from the rest of the world in American assets. That's represented by the blue line here, and as you can see, they're essentially mirror images of each other. So as we spend far more than we put out into the world through goods and services, these investments will ultimately bring the money back to us and bring dollars back into our pockets. That money is then used to innovate and stay technologically competitive. It is also the exact reason why we are able to import so much without exporting nearly as much, because we have money to spend thanks to the money flowing back from foreign investors. Secondly, it should be addressed that our president, quote unquote, created 18.6 million jobs in his first 2 years. I don't think I have a slide for this. A 3.1% increase since President Obama's second term, according to the balance. As much as I'm sure Trump would love to take credit for this, the simple fact of the matter is that the American economy is pretty much constantly growing at this point. And most of the growth can be attributed to actual market forces and near constant innovation. We are at the forefront of technology, specialized in a variety of different industries that require large amounts of labor and are a central component to the global economy. Giving Donald Trump credit for this increase, which quite frankly is not that great compared to some of the larger job creators of our history, such as Clinton or Roosevelt, is like giving a gold star for not burning the house down. As long as Trump doesn't completely destroy our economy, there will probably be growth. Oh yeah. Yes. So, as you can see, this was the 2008 recession and such, but we were already having significant job growth throughout Obama's second term. And then once Donald Trump came along, the overall job increase was not that significant in comparison to Obama's. Okay, third, the majority of our jobs are not being lost to other countries or immigrants. In fact, 85% of jobs lost in America are actually due to technological innovation. And that proportion continues to grow as we innovate at an extremely rapid pace. As for the remaining 15%, 13% of jobs are indeed lost to outsourcing, although this is not a terrible thing, as we will address later. Additionally, we gain about 200,000 jobs for every 15,000 jobs, according to Naked Economics, a best-selling book by Charles Wheeler. Meanwhile, Trump's new across-the-board steel and aluminum tariffs will result in the net loss of 146,000 American jobs, according to Quartz.com. So in short, the American economy is already growing in terms of jobs, and Trump is actually slowing that process to some degree through his tariffs. Okay. This is a painting from 14th or 15th century China. So, additionally, the idea that any anti-globalization policies have historically helped any country out ever should be dismissed. Of the top countries in the global economy today, not a single one was able to reach its full potential without the help of globalization. And all of them rely on trade to remain prosperous. Take China, for example. Centuries ago, China was at the forefront of technological innovation, incredibly prosperous, and in general better than any other country at the time. from an economic standpoint. You can thank it for gunpowder. However, the Ming Dynasty implemented increasingly isolationist policies, which caused China to lag behind in terms of innovation and prosperity due to its decreasing abilities to specialize. Ultimately, China was merely a bystander as Western Europe entered. Dang, this is really messing up. Hold on. It was merely a bystander as Western Europe entered the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s, a shell of what it had once been. Had China stayed globalized and continued to specialize, it is entirely possible that today it would not be the second most prosperous country. That's just how important it is to be able to specialize in a moment. Finally, the idea that other countries are stealing our jobs is absolutely ridiculous. In many ways, other countries are actually the good guys, and the American government is the real culprit for why so many people are suffering as a result of globalization. This is where I will present to you the first economic, this is where I will present the first economic concept, other than current and capital accounts. That is comparative and absolute advantage. So what you're seeing here is a production possibilities frontier. In short, all this does is show us how much a particular party or parties can produce in a given amount of time. For now, let's just focus on the red line for purposes of simplicity. This might be a decent representation of America. As Americans, we are privileged to have an economy that specializes in technology. Our educational system puts plenty of emphasis on STEM, and that allows many of us to go on to become engineers, computer scientists, or to go into a number of other highly skilled and therefore high-paying industries. As a result of this, with the majority of our collective brain power naturally going towards technology, As a result of this, the majority of our collective brain power will naturally go towards technology. For example, America continues to be a leading manufacturer of computer chips, which are made from silicon, thus Silicon Valley. For the sake of time, I will only focus on the parts of this concept that are necessary to explain my point. As I said earlier, the red line is America. We have an advanced economy with highly educated and skilled people who are able to engineer the best computer chips the world has to offer at a very large scale. Because of this, let's say in a given year's time we can produce, for purposes of exemplification, 2 million computer chips. However, we are not quite as great at producing t-shirts anymore. It is not the Industrial Revolution. We have a fairly high cost of living in the US relative to other countries. As a result, cheap labor will cost at best the minimum wage, $7.25 an hour. As a result, clothing companies have virtually no incentive to stay here and produce clothing, since doing so will cause their profits to be far lower than somewhere that has a far lower cost of living and thus lower wages, such as Mexico. Because of this, I'll say that America can produce only 1 million textiles per year. So as you can see, we are far better, relatively, at producing computer chips than we are t-shirts. Now, let's say this blue line is Mexico. Mexico has a far lower cost of living, and as a result, they can provide far cheaper labor to clothing businesses. These clothing businesses, as Donald Trump has pointed out, have gone to Mexico for their manufactured goods and have invested heavily in their plants in Mexico. Because of this, Mexico can produce double what America can make in a given year, at 2 million t-shirts per year. So obviously far higher than what America can produce. However, Mexico is not nearly as advanced technologically as America is. And its educational system is not even close to ours. As a result, if Mexico dedicates itself entirely to the production of computer chips, it will only produce half of what we make at 1 million computer chips. Again, this number is probably lower than that, but it is just for the purposes of exemplification. So does this make sense to all of you guys? All right, other than you guys who just came in. Here's where we start to see why knowing this is super important. As I said earlier, America can produce 2 million computer chips in 1 year, but only 1 million t-shirts in a year, assuming it completely dedicated itself to the production of either one. That means by producing one t-shirt, it is doing so at the opportunity cost of 2 computer chips. So, maybe I should write this down. Awesome. Okay, so guys saw that, so you might remember the production possibilities curve. So that means that, you know, if it can produce 2 billion chips per year and 1 million T-shirts per year. Oh boy. Okay. Then if it decides to only produce 1 million T-shirts, then it is giving up the opportunity to produce 2 million chips. And if it decides to produce only chips, it will produce 2 million chips at the cost of 1 million T-shirts. So we could also say that the cost of every chip is half a T-shirt. Or no, yes, half a T-shirt. And the cost of 1 T-shirt is 2 chips. Does that make sense?
Yes.
This is what opportunity cost is all about. This is what you guys learned in 3rd grade, but it's actually applied to economics. So now that's America. So what about Mexico? Well, let's apply this same concept, except obviously slightly different. All right. Okay. Mexico. So Mexico, as I said earlier, can produce 2 million T-shirts and 1 million chips. So Mexico can produce, as opposed to 1 chip for half a T-shirt, the cost of producing 1 chip is now 2 T-shirts. And the cost of producing 1 T-shirt is half a chip. So as you can see, Mexico can produce T-shirts for far less of a cost than America can. And America can produce chips at a far lower cost than Mexico can. So we would say that in terms of chips, America has a comparative advantage, and Mexico has a comparative advantage in terms of T-shirts, right? So, in short, Mexico is more efficient at producing T-shirts than America is. So now we trade, and so, okay, that's great. We're good at making computer chips. But what do we do now? We specialize in computer chips. We continue to stay at the forefront of technological innovation and maintain our dominant position in the computer chip market. Meanwhile, Mexico does the same for T-shirts. Then we trade. If we trade with Mexico, we can get T-shirts for a cost anywhere above Mexico's cost of half a computer chip, and anywhere below our cost of 2 computer chips. So now, as opposed to having to pay, so say we only made made T-shirts in America and only bought T-shirts in America, right? So, as opposed to now having to buy 1 T-shirt at the cost of 2 computer chips, now we can buy a T-shirt at the cost of half a computer chip, right? So, this line here is our new production possibilities curve. And essentially, along this curve, we would say that we can now buy a T-shirt for the cost of 1 computer chip, right? This is essentially a balance between the cost for America and the cost for Mexico. It's that equilibrium that we find in supply and demand. So, along this line is that beautiful thing we call trade. So, essentially, we can buy a T-shirt for 1 computer chip, and Mexico can buy a computer chip for 1 T-shirt. Now, obviously, computer chips are a lot more expensive than a T-shirt, unless you're buying like Gucci or Supreme or something like that. But for the average T-shirt, it's definitely much more expensive to buy a computer chip than the average T-shirt. But this is for purposes of exemplification. usually you're going to have a much higher volume of t-shirts, and as a result, a much lower volume of computer chips, so it'll kind of balance out. But if you guys have questions about that, I'll explain it to you later. So, we're good at making computer chips. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. So this way, everyone is better off. Along this production possibilities curve, Mexico can sell us their T-shirts at the cost of one computer chip, which makes them a profit of half a computer chip, and we can sell them our computer chips at the cost of one T-shirt, which gives us a profit of half a T-shirt. Now, in actual trade, it's much more complicated than this, but essentially, everyone is better off, even in the most complicated of situations, and it is all based off of this one single economic concept. So, how does this relate to Trump's policies? Well, you may have already guessed, but I'll proceed to explain it anyways. Trump wants to raise tariffs and prevent trade with other countries to save American jobs. The reality is, however, that this will make all parties worse off. If we raise tariffs and try to prevent imports from seeming as appealing, we will have to raise them enough to make them more expensive than American products, so nobody has an incentive to continue buying foreign products. We would have to make our T-shirts or our computer chips. No, our T-shirts. No, we would have to make foreign imports of T-shirts so expensive that it exceeds what we can produce our T-shirts at, which is, much less efficient of a cost. So, if we raise tariffs and try to prevent imports from seeming as appealing, we will have to raise them enough to make them more expensive than American products. For example, going off with the production and possibilities frontier, the cost of buying a Mexican T-shirt would have to exceed 2 computer chips in order for us to stop trading with them, because it would no longer be profitable. This makes T-shirts far more expensive for consumers of clothing, which just so happens to be every single one of us, as far as I know. This also makes Trump's precious American worker worse off as well, because although he or she may have gotten a new job, they will now have to pay far more for basic necessities. And most likely this will include not just T-shirts, but also any other basic necessity not originally produced in America that has tariffs placed on it, including food. Additionally, America will no longer be able to specialize nearly as much in what we are good at, which in this case is computer chips. Rather than having our engineers help our country stay at the forefront of computer technology, many will end up going to the textiles industry to fulfill the growing domestic demand for American T-shirts. We will lag behind in technological innovation, just like China did centuries ago. So, what I'm trying to say here is that if we force our country to continue buying foreign T-shirts for more expensive costs than what we were doing before Trump started putting in anti-globalization policies, it will cause us to have to spread around our labor to numerous different industries that we originally did not have to. And as a result, we will not be able to continue on the forefront of, say, computer chips or fighter jets or whatever America is really good at. So, as I start to conclude this talk, I want to express that the main thing you guys should take away from this is that Trump's policies simply do not align with some very basic economic concepts. As much as he and his fans would like to believe this is not the case, it simply will not make everyone better off in the long run if we raise tariffs against foreign goods. Are we losing some American jobs? Yes. However, that is almost entirely due to technological innovation. As we continue to innovate, that proportion of jobs lost to innovation will go up. The answer is not to put up walls against the forces of globalization, but rather to embrace it and allow the market forces to bring down the prices and bring up quality. Those who lose their jobs in the process should be able to have access to quality government programs to facilitate their transition to the next job. That way we can get the best of both worlds, cheap prices and competitive quality for everyday goods and services, specialization in what we are good at as a country, and most importantly, financial security for everyone willing to work. Thank you. All right, do we have any questions?
So obviously, with the computer chips, the T-shirts, that's a pretty simple analogy, but would more than, you could have like multiple factors, so like literally everything that America makes would be in this
Yeah, so it would just be take anything that America specializes in, take anything that another country specializes in, put those things on what we have the capacity to produce, and then you determine what your equilibrium price would be. So this was essentially made up. I figured out that essentially America is incredibly productive at creating computer chips, and our textile industry is essentially dead since the Industrial Revolution. But as I was doing my research, what occurred to me is that as America was going through its Industrial Revolution, manufacturing was huge, right? So all these other countries that happen to be trying to develop their their economies also happen to be going into manufacturing. So we're actually allowing them to bring up their economies by helping them out with these, in this case, t-shirts. So when you hear about low quality working conditions or really terrible working conditions, it resonates a bit with what our Industrial Revolution looked like with manufacturing and such, and child labor and extremely low wages. But when we continue to support these countries, yes, to some degree we are helping out the people that are doing that, but we also did the same thing at one point, and as we continue to support them, ultimately it will bring their economy up so that they can eventually afford to focus more on human resources, their environment, better working conditions, things like that. So as they become more prosperous, they'll be able to focus on that. That was a bit of a digression, but hopefully that makes sense. Anything else?
Yeah. Okay, so if we're so good at like manufacturing different things like computer chips per se, or just basically anything that we specialize in, and you were like, what did you say? You said like we help other countries, correct?
Yeah.
If we help other countries economically with our own economics, then how come certain countries that produce specialized goods for us are still down?
So other countries that we trade with, why are they still not?
Yeah, and how do we help them?
So there are a number of historical factors, but we could focus on, for example, well, all right, take it from like the very get-go, right? So take Western Europe. Because of its environmental factors, it was able to extract more resources, be more productive, eventually innovate more than most other countries around the world, and get a head start in front of everybody else, right? So once they got that head start, they were able to trade with other people. And so when you trade, both parties are made more well off. Let's say Western Europe was already double as well off as every other country in the world. Well, if Western Europe gets just as well off as another country, which is an ideal condition, but obviously does not happen that much. Usually it would be Western Europe gets way more well off than another country does, but let's just say Western Europe gets just as well off as another country does. Well, Western Europe is still double as well off as that other country, right? Does that make sense? So this other country might eventually, over time, they'd go up and up and up and up. This other country might be able to, be extremely economically prosperous, but unless they hit a gold mine or they implement some really good public policies that allow them to surpass Western Europe, they're not going to get on that same level. Does that make sense? All right, that was a good question. Any other?
I have more. The mirror. I forgot exactly what that graph was.
Current and capital accounts.
So for other countries, not just America, would that look different? Or for some other countries, or for most countries, would it look like a mirror image?
I personally have not really looked into that, but I would imagine that foreign investors are not going to invest very much in Uganda. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So Uganda, although honestly, because Uganda doesn't produce that much, obviously they'd be in a trade surplus in their current account, and their foreign investment would be in a deficit, but because they're, I don't know, maybe I would think it would still be a mirror image unless they're being like exploited by another country, or like in war or something. But I honestly couldn't tell you. As long as your economy is functioning at its like full, well, not full capacity, but it's functioning fairly normally, it's gonna look something like this, I would imagine. Good question. Anything else? All right. Thank you very much.